What if your grandparents' lunchbox held the secret to surviving hard times? These weren't trendy meals. They were gritty, resourceful, and sometimes all they had. Here are the forgotten lunches your grandparents ate not for taste, but to stay alive. When food was scarce and wallets were thin, people didn't reach for takeout. They reached for flour, grease, and canned tomatoes. Tomato gravy on bread wasn't created in a test kitchen. It was born out of wartime kitchens, Depression-era farmhouses, and rural lunch tables where stretching a dime was an art form. This dish turned pantry scraps into a hot, filling meal using little more than bacon drippings, flour, milk, or water, and canned tomatoes, if you were lucky. It wasn't gourmet, but it got the job done and kept bellies full without draining the family budget. There wasn't a formal recipe because no one needed one. You made it with what you had, thickened it to your liking, and poured it over yesterday's stale bread. That wasn't laziness, it was ingenuity. Housewives didn't have time to obsess over measurements. They were feeding 6 kids on a dime while boiling laundry out back. Tomato gravy on bread served as a survival staple in the South, especially during the Great Depression and into the post-war years. While it may sound like a side dish, back then it was the main course. In many Southern households, survival didn't come in the form of a hot roast or a fresh deli sandwich. It came cold, sliced, and spread between 2 pieces of white bread. The liver pudding sandwich was a fixture in lunch pails across the rural South, especially in North Carolina and surrounding areas where pork was plentiful, but every part had to serve a purpose. Liver, fat, and cornmeal were blended, spiced, and cooked into a loaf that could be eaten warm or chilled depending on the occasion, or more likely, the lack of a working stove. This wasn't food meant to impress. It was food meant to last. Simple, efficient, and high in protein, it could be eaten straight from the fridge, which made it ideal for quick lunches on the farm or in the textile mills. In terms of resourcefulness, it checked every box, nothing wasted, everything used, flavor optional. Some families added mustard for taste, others added prayer. There were no written recipes passed down for liver pudding sandwiches, just a general sense of proportion and a willingness to work with what was available. There was a time when even leftovers got a second life. Not out of trend, but out of sheer necessity. That's how oatmeal patties found their way onto lunch tables across Depression-era America. Cold, sticky bowls of morning oats didn't get tossed. They got transformed. Mixed with a bit of flour, a chopped onion if you had one, and maybe an egg if the chickens were feeling generous, yesterday's porridge became today's pan-fried meal. This wasn't about flavor complexity or visual appeal. It was about not going hungry. Survival and simplicity went hand in hand, and no one was above crisping up congealed oatmeal to stretch a food budget. If you could get them golden brown without them falling apart, you were considered a culinary genius. Some added ketchup, others added a little salt. Either way, lunch was served, and the stove got a workout. There were no cookbooks praising the virtues of fried oatmeal, but that didn't stop families from making it part of their weekly routine. The ingenuity behind oatmeal patties was less about invention and more about adaptation. You didn't need a recipe. You needed heat, patience, and the kind of determination that makes you fry breakfast twice. It may not have been anyone's favorite, but it filled stomachs and bought time. And that was enough. A fridge full of leftovers wasn't a sign of excess. It was a sign you'd be eating well, or at least eating something, the next day. One of the most beloved ways to repurpose mashed potatoes was turning them into potato cakes with onion gravy. In homes where nothing was wasted, leftover spuds were mixed with flour or breadcrumbs, shaped into patties, and fried in bacon grease or whatever fat was on hand. If they stuck together, it was a good day. If they didn't, you just called it hash and kept moving. The onion gravy was where the real alchemy happened. With little more than sliced onions, flour, and water, or milk if it hadn't soured, you could whip up a sauce that transformed humble cakes into a hot, savory meal. No meat, no problem. The gravy did the heavy lifting, adding richness and warmth without requiring more than a single onion and a strong stirring arm. There were no printed instructions tacked to the fridge, just a mental map of ingredients and an instinctive sense of proportion. passed down from generations who understood food as function first. Not every lunch from the past came hot off a skillet. Some were as simple as opening a jar and rinsing a few leaves. The peanut butter and lettuce sandwich might sound odd today, but for many families it was a practical, no-cook lunch that checked all the right boxes: cheap, quick, and shelf-stable. Peanut butter offered protein and calories, while crisp iceberg lettuce added texture and a dose of hydration, especially important during hot work days in the fields or factories. This pairing didn't come from a cookbook. It came from a refrigerator with not much in it. No slicing, no seasoning, no stove required. And when refrigeration was a luxury, iceberg lettuce was one of the few greens that could last a while without wilting. It's no surprise that it ended up playing co-star to the pantry hero: peanut butter. Spread it on white bread, slap on a lettuce leaf, and lunch was ready in under a minute, faster than any drive-through. Survival wasn't always about cooking. Sometimes it was about knowing how to make something out of almost nothing. This sandwich didn't win culinary awards, but it filled lunchboxes across mid-century America with something light, crisp, and surprisingly satisfying. When mayonnaise was in the fridge and saltines were in the pantry, lunch didn't require a trip to the store. It required a little creativity and an open mind. Saltine cracker salad was one of those Depression-era creations that looked like a last resort, but managed to find its way onto picnic tables and kitchen counters more than anyone expected. It combined crushed crackers, chopped hard-boiled eggs, diced tomatoes, and a generous spoonful of mayo, blended together until it held just enough shape to call it a meal. It wasn't about presentation. It was about making sure nothing went to waste. Tomatoes from the garden, eggs from the backyard coop, and crackers that were already going stale became something entirely new. With no oven, no stove, and no fancy tools, it was survival served cold. In fact, some folks called it poor man's potato salad, although it rarely needed the comparison. It held its own just fine. This wasn't a dish you'd find in polished cookbooks, but it was shared by word of mouth and memory, often made in minutes by those who didn't have the time or the ingredients for anything else. Saltine cracker salad was a masterclass in resourcefulness, proving once again that hunger fuels invention and mayonnaise covers a multitude of sins. In kitchens where meat was scarce and pennies were stretched thin, a pot of boiling cabbage wasn't a side dish. It was the entire meal. Add a few scoops of seasoned cornmeal, and you had a working man's lunch known as boiled cabbage and cornmeal dumplings. This wasn't about taste indulgence. It was about filling bellies with what the land, or the ration book, could afford. Cabbage was hearty, cheap, and lasted for weeks. Cornmeal, even cheaper, was a southern staple that could morph into dumplings with just water and salt. You didn't need cookbooks. You needed a pot, a stove, and the kind of intuition only experience teaches. Families would often toss in a ham bone if one was around, not for meat, but for flavor. The goal wasn't gourmet, it was nourishment. The dumplings, dense and plain, soaked up the cabbage broth like sponges, turning bland into bearable. In tough times, bearable was enough. There's a special kind of ingenuity in turning boiled leaves and cornmeal into a lunch that could carry you through a long afternoon of labor. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't delicate, but it was dependable. Boiled cabbage and cornmeal dumplings didn't just feed people, they reminded them that resilience often comes served in a bowl, steaming hot and seasoned with thrift. When meat was missing from the table and vegetables were in short supply, you turned to the one thing that could still make your eyes water: onions. Cornmeal-crusted fried onions weren't just a side dish. In many homes, they were lunch. Slice a big yellow onion, dredge the rings in seasoned cornmeal, and drop them into a hot skillet of oil or lard. That was the entire recipe, if you could even call it that. It was survival disguised as something that sizzled. The magic of this dish was in its thrift. Onions were cheap, lasted forever, and grew easily, making them a Depression-era staple. Cornmeal, already in every southern pantry, did double duty as breading and filler. It didn't require eggs, milk, or even refrigeration, just a good pan and a hot flame. That kind of simplicity was a necessity, not a choice. No one claimed these fried onions were elegant, but they offered crunch, warmth, and enough calories to push through the afternoon. Sometimes they were served alone, other times over bread or next to a spoonful of beans. And while they didn't carry the prestige of meat, they did the job with far less fuss. Cornmeal, crusted fried onions were lunch built from scraps, and a little kitchen grit. Not all meals required pots, pans, or even a working stove. Sometimes all it took was a can opener and a sleeve of saltines. Chipped beef and crackers was a minimalist's lunch, thin, salty slices of dried beef served cold or room temperature, usually straight from the jar or vacuum-sealed pouch. It was popular among servicemen during World War II and stayed in American pantries for decades after, thanks to its long shelf life and zero prep requirements. This wasn't a dish you prepared. It was one you assembled, often in seconds. That kind of efficiency was gold in homes where lunch breaks were short and kitchen resources were thinner than the meat itself. While some topped the beef with mustard or pickles, many just paired it with crackers and called it a day. The saltiness of the meat, preserved for longevity rather than taste, was balanced, barely, by the dry crunch of the cracker. It wasn't elegant, but it was edible. Its military roots meant it was widely available in surplus stores and often handed down in care packages to rural families. Survival and simplicity weren't just cooking principles, they were guiding forces. In households where every drop of bacon grease was saved in a tin on the stovetop, nothing went further or lasted longer than a batch of old-fashioned grease gravy and bread. Made from little more than rendered fat, flour, and water or milk if it was available, this dish was the very definition of survival cooking. There was no seasoning standard, no culinary flair, just the basic alchemy of turning scraps into sustenance. The bread, often stale or just a day from it, served as the vehicle. Poured hot over slices or biscuits, the gravy transformed even the driest crusts into something warm, filling, and deceptively comforting. You didn't need recipes, you needed instincts. Stir too long and it burned, stir too little and it lumped. But get it just right, and you had a meal that could feed a family on the flavor of yesterday's breakfast. During the Great Depression and into wartime America, this kind of food was more than economical. It was strategic. Nothing was thrown out, not even fat. Families knew how to stretch a dollar until it screamed, and this dish was the sound it made. Grease gravy and bread wasn't elegant or exciting, but it was practical, reliable, and one of the quiet heroes of frugal American lunches. In industrial towns across the Midwest, where wages were modest and meat was a luxury, resourceful home cooks found a clever solution to a very real problem: how to serve something that looked like chicken without actually having any. That solution was called mock chicken legs, more commonly known as city chicken. Ironically, it didn't contain a shred of poultry. Instead, it was usually made from ground pork or veal, molded onto wooden skewers to resemble drumsticks, then breaded, pan-fried, and baked. The concept took off in cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit during the 1930s and 40s. It offered the illusion of Sunday dinner on a Tuesday budget. But it wasn't just about appearance. It was a testament to the ingenuity born of limited options. Why serve plain meatballs when you could present them as a roast chicken leg with a little imagination and a box of toothpicks? There was no universal recipe. Families used whatever meat they could grind, whatever crumbs they had to coat, and whatever fat was left in the skillet. The goal wasn't culinary deception. It was sustenance, styled with just enough flair to lift spirits. In an era when a trip to the store wasn't always guaranteed, and certainly not daily, lunch often came down to whatever could be pulled from the backyard coop and the root cellar. That's how the hard-boiled egg and raw onion sandwich earned its place at the table. It required no fancy tools, minimal ingredients, and just enough boldness to bite into a raw onion and call it a meal. Hard-boiled eggs were a staple because they were portable, protein-packed, and easy to make in batches. Onions, especially yellow or white varieties, stored well through the winter and didn't spoil easily. Put them together between two slices of bread, often homemade, sometimes dry, and you had a lunch that lasted hours in a lunch pail without refrigeration. The combination delivered calories, nutrition, and a flavor profile strong enough to keep coworkers at a distance. This wasn't a dish created for comfort. It was built for efficiency. No measuring, no mixing, no mayonnaise in sight, just sliced egg, raw onion, salt if you had it, and maybe a smear of lard or butter if it was payday. It was survival wrapped in simplicity, unapologetically sharp, undeniably functional, and not likely to show up in a restaurant. Southern lunch tables in lean times often revolved around what could be pulled from the garden and what was left over from yesterday's dinner. That's where turnip greens and cornbread crumble came in, a humble dish built on two things rural families always seem to have: hearty greens and day-old cornbread. Turnip greens were easy to grow, packed with nutrients, and tough enough to survive unpredictable weather. They didn't need much, just water, salt, and a long simmer to bring out their full flavor. Meanwhile, cornbread was a near-daily fixture. When it went stale, it didn't go to waste. It went in the bowl. Crumbled right into the greens, it soaked up the pot liquor, that nutrient-rich cooking liquid often flavored with a ham hock or bacon grease if you had any to spare. It wasn't a garnish, it was lunch. This dish didn't rely on a recipe. You used what was on hand, adjusted the seasoning by memory, and served it hot, straight from the pot. It was resourcefulness in its purest form. No frills, no fuss, just a filling, flavorful meal created from the kind of ingredients that kept families going during hard times. In an era when store-bought sweets were a luxury and sugar was sometimes rationed, families got creative with what they had in the pantry. One of the simplest solutions was the molasses and butter sandwich, a quick, sticky, energy-packed lunch that made the most of basic staples. Molasses, once a common sweetener in American households, was cheaper than refined sugar and easier to store without refrigeration. When paired with butter and spread across slices of white or homemade bread, it became a surprisingly effective midday meal. This wasn't a delicacy. It was a necessity, especially in rural areas where molasses was bought by the gallon and butter came from the churn. It didn't require any heating, mixing, or measuring. It just took two ingredients, a knife, and the willingness to get your hands a little messy. Kids loved it for the sweetness, adults loved it for the calories, and everyone tolerated it for the fact that it was cheap and fast. Survival and simplicity walked hand in hand with this sandwich. There was no recipe written down, just a visual ratio of enough to cover the bread. It was resourceful, economical, and far more filling than it had any right to be. Canned goods weren't just convenience, they were insurance. In decades marked by economic instability and ration supplies, few pantry items worked harder than a small can of potted meat. Spread between two slices of soft white bread, potted meat sandwiches became a go-to lunch for families who needed calories without complication. Typically made from a mixture of pork, beef, chicken, or some mysterious combination thereof, potted meat was shelf-stable, inexpensive, and incredibly salty, which meant you didn't need much else to make it palatable. This wasn't about taste refinement. It was about stretching a can as far as it could go. One tin could feed multiple kids if you were conservative with the spreading. Some added mustard, others a slice of pickle, but most just kept it plain and kept it moving. The goal was to fill stomachs, not impress palates. There were no precise recipes passed down for this one, only the general understanding that when the label said meat, you didn't ask too many questions. The ingenuity was in making the unappealing edible day after day. For all its mystery, the potted meat sandwich offered one clear benefit: reliability. It didn't spoil, it didn't require cooking, and it delivered lunch fast, cheap, and with a hint of industrial-era charm. In the heat of a southern summer, with money tight and appetites growing, families leaned on the garden for relief. When there wasn't meat in the house, or even a slice of cheese, there was still the humble cucumber. That's where the cucumber and vinegar sandwich stepped in, offering a crisp, no-cook lunch that relied on nothing more than fresh produce, pantry staples, and practicality. Thin cucumber slices were soaked in vinegar with a bit of salt and pepper, sometimes with a pinch of sugar if you had a sweet tooth or a generous neighbor. After a short soak, they were drained and placed between slices of bread. White bread was the standard, but cornbread or homemade loaves weren't uncommon either. The result? A tart, refreshing sandwich that cost next to nothing and didn't heat up the kitchen. This dish didn't originate in restaurants or cookbooks. It came from a need to feed families quickly, cheaply, and with what was on hand. The vinegar extended the shelf life of the cucumbers, while the bread turned a salad into a sandwich. It was survival wrapped in simplicity, familiar, affordable, and repeatable all summer long. Cucumber and vinegar sandwiches may not headline menus today, but in leaner times they delivered exactly what was needed: something cool, edible, and easy on the budget. When pantries were nearly bare and time was of the essence, some lunches came together in under a minute, without a stove, knife, or second thought. The onion sandwich was one such meal, bold, unforgiving, and rooted in necessity. It consisted of raw onion slices laid thick between two slices of buttered bread, sometimes salted, occasionally peppered, and always potent. It wasn't made to please, it was made to last. Onions were cheap, easy to grow, and stored well through long winters. For many families, that meant they were always on hand, even when the rest of the kitchen was empty. The bread was usually whatever was left from earlier in the week, and the butter, if available, added just enough fat to soften the blow. Flavor? Strong. Shelf life? Impressive. Breath afterward? Consider yourself warned. This sandwich had no origin story worth romanticizing. It emerged from the kind of practical thinking that defined Depression-era kitchens. Use what you've got, don't waste anything, and get through the day. There was no need for recipes when hunger dictated the menu. Survival and simplicity were the sandwich's strengths. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't subtle, and it didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. In households where biscuits were made by the dozen and nothing was ever tossed, yesterday's breakfast often became today's lunch. One practical example: the leftover biscuit with tomato slice. A simple open-faced meal that combined stale bread with the bounty of the backyard garden. When summer tomatoes were ripe and plentiful, they were sliced thick, dusted with salt, and laid across a halved biscuit, cold, crumbly, and still holding together from the morning before. There was no need for cooking, no dressing things up. The acidity of the tomato paired with the biscuit's dense texture made for a surprisingly balanced bite. Some folks added a smear of bacon grease or a touch of mayonnaise if they had it, but often it was just tomato and bread, plain, filling, and ready in seconds. Tomatoes were one of the most commonly grown crops in family gardens across the South and Midwest, and biscuits were a fixture of nearly every breakfast. Combining the two wasn't a recipe, it was a reflex, born of a deep understanding that nothing should ever go to waste. This lunch was as much about ingenuity as it was about flavor. It turned scraps into sustenance with no fuss, no heat, and no budget. In the southeastern states, where peanuts were plentiful and every grain of rice had to count, a peculiar but practical lunch emerged from the depths of frugality. Boiled peanut and rice casserole was one of those dishes that didn't come from a cookbook. It came from a bare pantry and a determined mindset. Boiled peanuts, soft and salty from hours in a pot, were shelled and mixed into plain cooked rice, sometimes with an onion, a splash of bacon drippings, or even a spoonful of leftover broth if the stars aligned. This was not a meal designed for flavor first, it was engineered for efficiency. Peanuts, technically legumes, packed enough protein to substitute for meat, while rice delivered the bulk. Together, they created a dish that could feed a family with almost no cost. If it stuck to your ribs, it was working. If it didn't, well, you added more rice. During hard times, Southerners turned this humble combination into a kind of rural risotto, less creamy, more chewy, and about a tenth the price. The ingenuity was in its repeatability: boil, mix, reheat, and repeat. It's not likely to appear on modern menus, but for a generation that valued survival over sophistication, boiled peanut and rice casserole was exactly the kind of dish that turned scarcity into sustenance. In homes where a bag of noodles could last a week and butter was considered a luxury, families found ways to turn the simplest ingredients into something warm and filling. Buttered noodles with breadcrumbs was a staple that required almost nothing but delivered comfort in spades. Cooked egg noodles were tossed with melted butter, sometimes margarine if money was tight, and topped with toasted breadcrumbs, usually made from stale bread too dry for sandwiches but too precious to throw away. This dish didn't rely on measurements or fancy techniques. You cooked the noodles, browned the crumbs in a pan, and combined everything with a bit of salt and pepper. If garlic or parsley made it into the mix, it was probably thanks to a generous neighbor or an ambitious backyard herb pot. But even in its most basic form, it offered just enough fat and starch to feel like a proper meal. The breadcrumbs weren't just garnish, they added texture, bulk, and value. A single slice of bread could stretch an entire pot of noodles. This kind of cooking wasn't glamorous, but it was smart. It used what was available and wasted nothing. In parts of the South, lunch didn't always require a stove, just a spoon and a strong stomach. Cornbread and buttermilk bowl was one of the most enduring examples of rural ingenuity, combining two of the most accessible ingredients in any farmhouse kitchen. Stale cornbread was crumbled into a bowl and drowned in cold buttermilk, then eaten like cereal. It was tangy, filling, and absolutely unpretentious. Buttermilk, a byproduct of churning butter, was often available in homes that kept dairy cows or bartered with neighbors. Cornbread, made daily in many households, never went to waste, even when it hardened overnight. Together, the pair delivered protein, carbs, and a good bit of gut fortitude. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to sustain. You didn't need to measure or season. If you could tear and pour, you had lunch. Some added salt, others a touch of onion, and a few daring souls even tossed in hot sauce. But at its core, the meal was defined by simplicity and survival. It was a common lunch for farmers, mill workers, and school kids alike, especially in summer when cooking indoors meant heating the whole house. In working-class kitchens where time was short and money shorter, some lunches pulled double duty, hearty enough for farm labor, cheap enough for the grocery list. That's where fried bologna and grits came in. Bologna, the budget-friendly meat that could last a week in the fridge, hit the skillet with a satisfying sizzle. Cut a few slits in the edges so it wouldn't puff into a meat balloon, brown both sides, and it was ready. No seasoning needed. Bologna brought its own salty character to the table. Grits, made from ground corn, were already a southern staple. Boiled with water or milk when available, they offered warmth and volume without breaking the bank. When paired with bologna, the result was a lunch that filled the stomach, warmed the bones, and got folks back in the field, on the job, or through the afternoon stretch. It was a dish built from practicality, a meat that never spoiled too quickly, and a grain that could feed a crowd for pennies. No recipe cards, no measurements, just intuition and repetition. Whether served in tin lunch pails or on chipped porcelain plates, fried bologna and grits was a testament to resourcefulness, and to the kind of lunches that kept America running on full stomachs and modest means. When the pantry was nearly bare and meat was out of reach, desperation and creativity often met between two slices of bread. One of the most bare-bones examples of survival cooking was the ketchup sandwich. Made with just white bread and a few squeezes of ketchup, this lunch was less about satisfaction and more about simply getting by. It was a Depression-era staple in homes where condiments did more than enhance meals. They became the meals. Ketchup offered sugar, vinegar, and a hint of tomato, which in hard times counted as flavor, vegetable, and seasoning all in one. Some families toasted the bread for texture, others added margarine if it was on hand, but more often than not, it was just straight ketchup on plain sandwich bread, quick to prepare, easier to stretch, and impossible to forget once you'd eaten one. No one grew up dreaming of ketchup sandwiches, but many grew up because of them. They reflect the raw ingenuity of households that refused to go hungry, even when the options were thin. For families living off the land or working with tight grocery budgets, greens weren't a side. They were the meal. One of the most enduring examples of this was mustard greens and rice. Mustard greens, with their sharp, peppery bite, were easy to grow, fast to harvest, and incredibly resilient. They thrived in backyard plots and didn't ask for much, just soil, water, and sun. Once picked, they were boiled down to tenderness, often with a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar if times were better. Rice, on the other hand, was the reliable filler. Bought in bulk and stretched across countless meals, it soaked up flavor and delivered calories without complaint. When combined, these two ingredients formed a humble but sustaining lunch, one built entirely from what was available, not what was ideal. Some cooks added broth or a ham bone for depth, but most worked with what they had. That was the beauty of it. Resourcefulness over recipes, ingenuity over indulgence. This dish wasn't flashy, but it was full of intent. It kept workers going, stretched garden harvests, and proved that filling a stomach didn't require a full pantry. Open a can, peel an onion, grab some bread, lunch was served. In homes where protein was precious and refrigeration was limited, few meals delivered as much punch per penny as the sardine and onion sandwich. Sardines, packed in oil or mustard sauce, were shelf-stable, high in protein and omega-3s, and cheap enough to buy by the dozen. Onions added bite, bulk, and a welcome crunch, all without requiring cooking or refrigeration. Together, they made a no-nonsense sandwich that got the job done, flavorful, durable, and impossible to forget. This dish thrived on survival and simplicity. Sardines didn't spoil, didn't need heating, and required nothing but a fork. You could mash them, lay them whole, or smear them across the bread like a stubborn spread. Onions were always on hand in rural households. They stored well, grew fast, and brought life to even the plainest meal. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. The smell alone may have cleared a room, but in leaner times it also cleared plates. And while it may not have won culinary awards, the sardine sandwich was full of ingenuity, turning pantry staples into fuel for long days of labor. Cornish pasty was a portable meal that was an essential food for one specific group of people: miners. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Montana, and other popular mining regions in the United States, this was the meal to have every day. It came from Cornwall, England, and it was this handheld meat and potato pie that became so beloved by coal, copper, and iron ore miners. These miners would always be working in dirty, dark, damp, and dangerous caverns, and they had no way to really ever wash their hands in the middle of work. It's not like people were going to be investing in or carrying bottles of sanitizer. The pasties, though, weren't going to be a problem in this regard. You could hold them up by the crust and just eat the filling. Of course, this meant that miners would have to throw away the crust, but you were still eating the majority of the meal. This was also durable, and it could stay warm for hours and hours, which made it ideal for miners. Despite what you might think, some of those mines really get low temperature-wise. It was also something that Cornish miners brought into the country when they eventually immigrated. They had settled in American mining towns in the 1800s, and these pasties have been a tradition in America as well ever since. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, this one was definitely a slay. The once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. Blue crab was a really common and affordable food for a lot of coastal communities. It has become a sought-after item in places like Maryland and Louisiana and the Carolinas. But how did it get here? Blue crab was considered an everyday coastal food that was abundant among fish markets and fishermen. You would go take a walk along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and all you would ever see is a seemingly endless supply of blue crab that would never really go down either. For a lot of working-class families, this was a staple protein that was really helping them get through the day, while also making sure they were meeting their nutrition needs. Now, the labor process here was really hard. It took a lot to make blue crab, and cracking blue crabs to get the different kinds of meat was really time-consuming. It meant that they were less desirable for other consumers who basically would prefer lobster or oysters, especially the rich kind. They were really cheap and they weren't ever given away in fishing towns. People made use of everything they could, mostly because they were so available, you know? While you would think that would mean that people would essentially always sell the excess fish, they would actually just stock up on it for winters and consume it. Blue crab started to become expensive thanks to the rise of commercial fishing and a lot of environmental work that had risen in the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crab populations were starting to decline really sharply, and it became a thing of national concern. That and the high labor cost meant that blue crab was starting to get really pricey. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Cold fried chicken wasn't exactly what the name makes it sound like. You can't really cold fry something, obviously, but what you can do is serve fried chicken that's been chilled, or fried chicken that's at least at room temperature. See, this was something that got popular at picnics, and it was a way for people to get rid of leftovers when they didn't have microwaves. As you might know, fried chicken tends to lose a lot of its charm when you just warm it up on a pan and stove. Now, I'm no one to judge, but that's just not how you do it. Naturally though, if you don't have a microwave, that's where your head would go, and a lot of people just didn't back then. So, what's the next step? Do we bite the bullet and eat that delicious fried chicken cold or at room temperature? Or do we warm it up and lose a lot of the bang for buck value that comes with a 3-piece combo for like $2 or $3? Most people stuck with the first option. Cold fried chicken would also be good as a work lunch because it was an easy way to get rid of your leftovers if you didn't feel like eating it at home, plus it was super quick. Just grab the fried chicken, box it, and go. You had your work lunch for that day sorted. It caught on a lot more than you'd think, really. Carrot and raisin salad sandwiches were the prime example of how to make something healthy not taste like death. They were the best thing to have whenever you would visit the countryside, and even people in urban areas started to adopt this recipe. That's because when you see a genuinely good deal, you just don't let it go. And there's rarely a deal as good as this one. Raisins were shelf-stable, sweet, naturally full of sugar, and they could last for weeks if kept properly. Just a bit of Miracle Whip would do wonders for the dish, too. Carrots, on the other hand, were extremely cheap, reasonable to buy in bulk, and for most people in the countryside, a standard crop that they were already growing. They only required some grating and mixing, and it basically was the perfect summer dish because of how refreshing it was. I'm sure the experience of melting in the summer and being forced to deal with the fact that you're an adult human is one we all dread. In times like that, and since it's summer, it's always like that, you want to really spend as little time in the kitchen as possible. A dish like this works even better because you have to spend all of 15 minutes to get it done, and in return, you get a whole haul of goodies. Vitamin A, natural sugar content, fiber, and my mom used to tell me carrots helped improve your memory. So if you're looking to try a new kind of salad, this 60s sensation is probably for you. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Cold pork pie was weird. It was supposed to be this British savory pastry that was probably the only dish best served cold after revenge, but I think it fell short on a lot of fronts. First, let's start with what constitutes a cold pork pie. This frigidly cold piece of British culture comes fully equipped with American favorites like lard, chopped or ground pork, nutmeg, mace, and lots of other stuffings. Plus, you know how people start experimenting with food and adding their own twists and turns wherever they can, no matter what. Who really sticks to tradition when you have like 5 different kinds of cheese to try? Anyway, while all of that sounds pretty good, fun, and a perfect environment for some serious brainstorming with what you can do with a pork pie, it was the savory jelly and cold aspect of it that kind of didn't stick too well. After the baking, you were supposed to pour a savory jelly made out of pork stock into the pie through a pretty tiny hole in the crust. Once the jelly would set and cool, it would enrich the flavor of the pie even more and help to preserve the meat as well. Pork pies were, for this reason, always served cold. However, America is a place that's really used to having their pork pies hot. And as you can probably tell, that's why you don't see bakeries, homes, or offices having cold pork pie days anymore. Macaroni and tomato soup bakes were an easy-to-handle casserole that was extremely hot in the working-class communities throughout the middle half of the 20th century. This was a dish that took elbow macaroni with canned tomato soup, and it was almost always Campbell's. A few more pantry staple ingredients would ensure an inexpensive and wonderful meal that maybe the kids would take a few rounds getting used to. For the adults, though, it was the best way to have comfort food on a budget besides potatoes. All you needed was cheese, milk, and eggs if they were available, but even without these, the dish could still be made. It just would not be as thick, rich, or as flavorful. The best part about this was that all you had to actually do was just boil the pasta and you would be set for the entire day. This could include bits of ground beef, bacon, or ham, whatever kind of protein is your choice really. But it could also be made creamy and with just aromatics and herbs. There was a lot of versatility with this bake, and that's because it was so simple. It made for a very flexible dish that could fit a lot of people's preferences easily, with almost none of the fuss you normally associate with homemade pasta dishes. This is so easy, even your teenagers could pick it up, really. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives, and olives or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Navy bean loaves are pretty much exactly what you think they are. Want the comfort of a baked loaf along with all the benefits and muscle building of 3 different kinds of beans? You've found the right recipe. This loaf was a budget-friendly, meatless meal that became popular among the working class and people who were trying to cut down on how much meat they were eating. Growing health concerns really made people turn to dishes like this more and more often because they were realizing that they couldn't afford, financially, physically, or mentally, several health scares per year just because of higher cholesterol or something. Bean loaves were something that were synonymous with being a clean, healthy dish. They were also very filling, and they would go around a family of 4 pretty easily. Beans were a great source of fiber, not just protein, so they also made you full for longer. You could literally just mash and blend them into a thick paste. You could also leave a few chunks in there for a better bite, and then you would just need breadcrumbs and crackers to bind everything together. Pour in some eggs for a better shape, and throw it in the oven. Ploughman's lunch was this really traditional British cold meal, and I guess you'll find a lot of these on the list. The basic combo here was basically just bread, some pickles, chutneys, apples, and cheese. You'd also get chutneys, which I'm not sure what that's worth. The British never really made good ones anyway. Hey, I'm only kidding. It's quintessentially a European breakfast though, and over there it's even considered rustic. But over here, just like the previous item, this was considered pretty controversial. Now, most of the setup here was something any pure-blooded American could work with. You have your farmhouse loaves, some sourdough if that's not your type, or even multi-grain bread. We've eaten Subway on hungrier days with those same options, right? It was just the cold meat part that wouldn't vibe well with a lot of people. I mean, really though, what do you expect? This is the land of cookouts with grills, deep-fried chicken fillets, and melted gooey cheese on just about everything. Cold just doesn't fit anywhere in that picture. So, like I was just telling you, Spam used to be the next big thing, and for good reason too. We had things like Spam and cheese roll-ups. A typical 70s office lunch would look like slices of Spam that had been rolled up with mustard and cheese. Now, these could either be grilled to enhance the smokiness of the Spam and make it contrast nicer with the pineapple, or you could bake it so that the cheese would melt and the mustard would mix in with it better for an overall more well-rounded flavor. All things considered, this was on the right track. It was quick, it was tasty, it was healthy, and it was also what people needed during a time where re-entering the workforce was really hard and put a lot of people out of their usual routines. The thing is, America is known for fickle trends. We'll like something one day, swear by it the next, and forget it halfway into the night. Spam and cheese roll-ups were good, but they took a sideline and started being party food more than a work lunch. Cold pork pie was weird. It was supposed to be this British savory pastry that was probably the only dish best served cold after revenge, but I think it fell short on a lot of fronts. First, let's start with what constitutes a cold pork pie. This frigidly cold piece of British culture comes fully equipped with American favorites like lard, chopped or ground pork, nutmeg, mace, and lots of other stuffings. Plus, you know how people start experimenting with food and adding their own twists and turns wherever they can, no matter what. Who really sticks to tradition when you have like 5 different kinds of cheese to try? Anyway, while all of that sounds pretty good, fun, and a perfect environment for some serious brainstorming with what you can do with a pork pie, it was the savory jelly and cold aspect of it that kind of didn't stick too well. After the baking, you were supposed to pour a savory jelly made out of pork stock into the pie through a pretty tiny hole in the crust. Once the jelly would set and cool, it would enrich the flavor of the pie even more and help to preserve the meat as well. Pork pies were, for this reason, always served cold. However, America is a place that's really used to having their pork pies hot. And as you can probably tell, that's why you don't see bakeries, homes, or offices having cold pork pie days anymore. They don't call this the decade of casseroles for no reason. A vegetable and rice bake was an extremely low-effort, simple and affordable casserole that became very common among working-class families in factory towns. It was also really common in farming communities throughout most of the 1970s and 1940s because it was a very easy way to stretch lots of vegetables and rice into this family-sized portion. It did all that without really cutting into your pantry either. Rice was one of the most affordable grains you could buy, and if you had a paddy field to grow them on, then that was even better. In southern and midwestern households, canned and frozen vegetables were always stocked as much as they could be. They were available throughout the year, most people bought them in bulk, and they were rationed out throughout the months. Now, this could even include little bits of meat if you liked it like that, but most people decided to keep it strictly on the vegetarian side. Why? Well, there's just a lot of meat dishes, especially casseroles already. And besides, with all the vegetables that people were packing into this, it was a nutritional powerhouse. Seriously, this was the kind of thing you'd take for your kids when you wanted them to grow up big and strong and everything. Factory and mill workers were always bringing these in as there were almost always leftovers to go around. Fish finger sandwiches started off as being wonderful party food and a pretty reasonable meal to go for at diners, but they ended up being something that was also a dish people wanted more of in their daily routines. Some tartar sauce, a fried fish, and 2 slices of bread have never done anyone wrong. It's something you can rely on, and it's a perfect intersection between convenient, unfamiliar, and healthy. Lots of people that were trying to take care of their diet, cut out a bit of their usual sources of protein, and just eat a bit more organic would opt for sandwiches like this. I think if you ever really want to make something pop off in America, you just put it in a sandwich, because that at least guarantees that everyone will try it, you know? Fish finger sandwiches are sometimes a recipe that people say we got from European culture, but it's something I think fishermen have been living off of forever. So not only is this a dish you would see in a tech labyrinth, otherwise known as offices, you would also just see fishermen and dock workers eating these after a hard day's work. It would put some pep in your step, and that's never really something people can have too much of. I think that now sandwiches have become more advanced since accessibility has only gone up with the amount of frozen foods we have now, so these probably have taken a bit of a back seat. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. When it comes to sandwiches, only a few were as satisfying as the roast beef sandwich. So, many sandwiches were originally created as a clever way to repurpose leftovers, and this one was no exception. Roast beef sandwiches often started with leftovers from Sunday dinner. The Sunday roast was a time-honored tradition, and any extra beef was used to make delicious sandwiches for lunch the next day. In 1900, the dish was described by the Washington Post as unattractive and as a tired ark in a gravy flood. However, it gained popularity in the coming years when Grandma decided to take matters into her own hands, and by 1931, some critics even went as far as to describe it as a true taste of South Dakota. The bread for Grandma's roast beef sandwich was often homemade, and boy did she know how to dress it up. Whether it was a dollop of horseradish sauce, a spread of mustard, or a smear of mayonnaise, Gram knew exactly what it needed, and if we got lucky, she even snuck in a slice of cheese. This one is an oddball. Banana and mayonnaise sandwiches were apparently all the rage back then. It was really surprising how common they had become, because usually you would give something like this a bad look and keep moving on with your day, waiting for, the chance to get an actual meal. It's definitely something no one could imagine eating in today's world. This sweet and savory combination actually had die-hard fans, though. Whether it was the fact that this was a convenient sandwich you could throw together in seconds, or how filling and high-calorie it was, people loved it. I mean, being honest with you, I've seen some pretty bizarre banana combinations over the course of preparing this video, but this one definitely stuck in my memory for a little bit. But hey, who can argue with health? And as far as that was concerned, this was a jackpot. Bananas were a natural source of energy and sugar, and mayonnaise was something that really made the dish more filling. This was also particularly popular in the South, and I know you're thinking that's really out of place, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, but the South has definitely been an experimentative place with its food. You could even get this at diners for the right price. On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below with your favorite dish from the list.